is sentenced, well, convicted, then sentenced, to perhaps 20, 25 years in a maximum security prison, like Broadmoor, Rampton, Ashurst. Remember those iconic prisons? Then you get involved. At what point are you involved, and what's your starting point when you're going to deal with, to try and understand and spend time with somebody who's done something unimaginable?
Okay, well, just to say that firstly, Broadmoor and Ashworth, etc., they're special hospitals.
Yes.
So they are, yes. So I'm talking about working in prisons.
Yes.
So, and just to say as well that I don't actually deliver the treatment currently. I still am very much involved in complex high-risk cases across various prisons, but not in treatment.
Yeah.
That's what the book's about. So when I was working in the 1990s, the first point would be that that every sex offender coming into the maximum security prison would be seen and would be assessed by a psychologist. And what you'd be trying to do at that point is to try and engage with them, to open them up a little bit, and to inquire as to whether they would be willing to engage in further treatment. And if they were willing to do that, following the assessment, then they would be placed into group work, the sex offender treatment program we were running at the time, and I would be engaging with them intensively, so 3-4 times a week for between 9 months to a year.
And what kind of things would you say to somebody whose humanity, whose worldview is so different from probably most people walking the streets freely outside the prison?
What would I say to them? Well, I guess what you're trying to do is you're trying to help them to understand why they did what they did. So it's a bit like a jigsaw puzzle in a way. You're trying to gather the information. You're trying to understand what's happened to them over their lives, what decisions they've made, for them to end up in a position where they've ended up committing a horrendous offence.
Are you also trying to get them to open up about their feelings toward their victim? Because time and again we've seen really awful cases where a perpetrator, has either shown no remorse or very minimal remorse and doesn't seem to connect whatsoever with their victim and the understanding that they've done something terrible.
Yes, and I think that I have seen that a lot, and that is very common. Yes, that is something we did try to do in the treatment programs. So try to encourage the offenders to take the perspective of the victim and how the impact really on the victims and the wider victims, of course. So these types of offences don't just impact one person. There's the whole sort of ripple effect across family, friends, etc. So yes, you'd certainly be trying to encourage that perspective.
And I'm sure each individual, each case is different, but there must be some common factors, common themes that drive somebody into that position, that determine that somebody has gone from being a child who's hopefully loved, or maybe not at a very early age, through the youth offender system, and then eventually possibly into committing a really terrible act. What are some of the common factors, the common drivers?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I think each case is different and you treat everybody as an individual. But there are usually, you can see patterns, there are underlying sort of reasons why people do what they do. And they'd usually be clustered really into areas like sort of having difficulties in relationships, having difficulty coping, having difficulty solving their problems, having dysfunctional attitudes and beliefs about women, about sex with women, about sexual relationships with children. So they would be some of the sort of the common areas that you would see.
And I've concentrated a lot on the darker side, on people who might be seen as sociopaths, who don't engage, who find it very, very difficult, who are almost predetermined to end up in that situation. But there must be rays of light in your book where you've found ways of opening up something in somebody, because in the end we're all human beings. What can you tell us about that? the people who you've really kind of connected with and maybe helped to change?
Yeah, and I think there are rays of light in the book, and I hope people who read it can see that. But I think when you're working with people for intensively, sort of between 9 months and a year, you get to know them as people. You start to see a side of them, perhaps, that lies behind the offending. So you start to see perhaps their humour or their likes and their dislikes. And you start to understand a bit more about them. It's a perk of the job in a way when you see the penny dropping for them and they start to understand why they did what they did. So yes, and I think sometimes you think you can see the sort of the hope in people that perhaps they can change and they want to change. So that they would be the rays of hope, I think.
Yeah, and when we look at the 3 R's that determine a sentence, you've got the risk, you've got the retribution, and the rehabilitation. Which one would you focus most on? I presume it's rehabilitation.
Yes, it's the rehabilitation, yes. But forensic psychologists are also very heavily involved in risk assessment. So ultimately our job is to protect the public. And everything we do, through assessment, through treatment, that is with one aim in mind, and always has been for me, and that is to prevent further sexual violence.
How much better are we getting at preventing sexual violence, preventing people ending up in this situation where they're behind bars for decades and where they have taken a life, compared to when you started this in the 90s? How much further along are we now?
Well, I think we've learnt a lot. So I'm not really sure how much further along we are in terms of success rates, but I think we are learning. It's such a complex area. I've been involved, as I say, for 25 years, and we know so much more than we did then. But I think there's such a long way to go. And treatment doesn't stand in isolation. Mm-hmm. There's the whole sort of cultural backdrop that we need to think about. There's education, employment, opportunities for convicted prisoners being released into the community. All that's really important, as well as treatment.
And finally, and briefly, Rebecca, whom is your book destined for, designed for? Is it for psychologists and specialists, or can anybody read it?
I think anybody can read it. I think I really wrote it with the public in mind. So psychologists get to go behind bars. They know what's going on, forensic psychologists. Yeah. I really wanted to open the book up for the general public. Most people don't get to go in maximum security prisons.
All right, Dr. Rebecca Myers, forensic psychologist, the author of Inside Job, The Life of a Prison Psychologist. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Times Radio.
Across the UK.